the craziest survival methods used by ancient humans during the Ice Age. Imagine waking up in a world where the temperature never rises above freezing for months at a time, where the nearest food source is a 12-ton woolly mammoth with tusks longer than your entire body, where a single mistake in judgment means death not just for you, but for everyone in your group. This was not a nightmare. This was Tuesday for our ancestors during the Ice Age. The Pleistocene epoch, which began about 2.5 million years ago, was a time of extreme climate swings. Massive ice sheets advanced and retreated across the northern hemisphere. At its peak, glaciers over 3 kilometers thick covered Chicago, London, and Berlin. Sea levels dropped so low that you could walk from Siberia to Alaska. And somehow, impossibly, humans not only survived this world, they conquered it. But the methods they used to do so are nothing short of insane by modern standards. These were not simple cavemen huddling around fires. These were brilliant, resourceful, and sometimes terrifyingly creative survivors who developed techniques so effective that some of them have never been replicated. Let me show you the craziest ways our ancestors made it through the coldest era in human history. Let us start with hunting, because if you want to understand Ice Age survival, you have to understand what they were hunting. The megafauna of the Pleistocene were not like the animals we know today. Imagine a woolly mammoth, 4 meters tall at the shoulder, 6 tons of muscle, fat, and fur, tusks that curved in massive spirals, each one weighing over 100 kilograms. And these creatures did not live alone. They traveled in herds of 20, 30, sometimes 50 individuals. Now imagine trying to kill one with a sharpened stick. That is exactly what early humans did, but they did not do it recklessly. They developed sophisticated hunting techniques that turned their physical disadvantages into devastating advantages. One of the most remarkable methods was the drive-in trap strategy. Hunters would identify a natural bottleneck in the landscape, a narrow valley or a cliff edge. Then, working as a coordinated team, they would stampede a herd of mammoths or bison toward it. The panicked animals, unable to turn or stop, would tumble over the edge or become trapped in a confined space where hunters could finish them. Archaeological evidence of this strategy has been found across Europe and North America. At sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelade in Jersey, archaeologists discovered piles of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros bones at the base of a cliff, mixed with stone tools. The pattern was unmistakable. This was a killing ground, used repeatedly over thousands of years. But the drive method required favorable terrain. What did they do on the open steppe, where there were no cliffs or valleys? They invented something terrifying, the persistence hunt. Humans are not the fastest animals. We cannot outrun a mammoth or a woolly rhinoceros. But we have one extraordinary ability that no other animal possesses. We can run for hours without stopping. We sweat to cool ourselves. We breathe independently of our stride. We are the greatest endurance athletes in the animal kingdom. Persistence hunting exploited this advantage. A group of hunters would single out an animal, a mammoth or a giant deer, and begin chasing it. Not sprinting, just jogging steadily. The animal, faster in short bursts, would sprint away. The hunters would track it and catch up. The animal would sprint again and again for hours, sometimes for an entire day. Eventually, the animal would overheat. Mammoths and woolly rhinos, covered in thick fur, could not dissipate heat efficiently. They would collapse from exhaustion and hypothermia. The hunters would walk up to the fallen giant and finish it with spears at close range. This method seems almost impossible to believe, but anthropologists have documented modern persistence hunts among the Sand people of the Kalahari, who run down antelope in exactly the same way. Our ancestors did it against animals the size of buildings. Now, once you have killed a 6-ton mammoth, you face a new problem. How do you use every single part of it? because in the Ice Age nothing could be wasted. And this is where our ancestors became true masters of resource utilization. A mammoth was not just food, it was a walking hardware store. The meat, of course, was eaten. But here is where things get clever. In the freezing temperatures, meat could be stored naturally. Hunters would dig pits in the permafrost, essentially natural freezers, and cache massive quantities of meat for months. Some of these frozen meat caches were so effective that paleontologists have found mammoth meat still preserved in Siberian permafrost after 40,000 years. The fat was equally valuable. Mammoth fat was rendered and used as fuel for lamps. It burned slowly and cleanly, providing light during the endless winter darkness. It was also consumed directly. In an environment where every calorie mattered, fat was the most efficient energy source available. A single mammoth could provide enough fat to sustain a family group for an entire winter. The bones became architecture, not metaphorically, literally. On the frozen plains of Ukraine and Russia, where trees were scarce or non-existent, early humans faced a brutal construction challenge. You cannot build a wooden hut if there are no trees. So they built with what they had, the bones of the animals they killed. At sites like Mezhyrich in Ukraine, archaeologists discovered circular structures built entirely from mammoth bones. Each hut required the bones of several dozen mammoths. The skulls formed the foundation. The long leg bones created the walls, carefully interlocked and probably lashed together with sinew. The tusks were used as roof supports and entrance arches. The whole structure was covered with animal hides, creating a shelter that could withstand winds of over 100 kilometers per hour and temperatures of 50 below zero. These were not crude piles of bones. They were carefully engineered structures. The builders selected specific bones for specific purposes. Jawbones were used as structural supports. Pelvis bones created a solid base. The spiral tusks created arched doorways. Some of these huts had storage pits dug into the frozen ground beneath the floor, creating cold storage for food. Inside these bone huts, the centerpiece was always the hearth, a carefully managed fire that never went out, and maintaining that fire required its own set of survival skills. Firekeeping was a sacred duty. The hearth fire was never allowed to die, because restarting a fire from scratch in Ice Age conditions was extraordinarily difficult. Tinder was scarce. Everything was frozen or damp. The materials that we take for granted, dry leaves, grass, bark, simply did not exist on the frozen steppe. So what did they burn? The answer might surprise you. They burned bones. Mammoth bones, especially the cancellous, spongy bone tissue, contain trapped fat and marrow. When placed in an already hot fire, bone burns slowly and produces intense heat. It was the Ice Age equivalent of coal. Archaeologists have found hearths filled with burned bone fragments at numerous sites, indicating this was a widespread and deliberate practice. They also burned dried animal dung. On the treeless steppe, dung from mammoths, bison, and horses was one of the few readily available fuels. It burned hot and steady, producing less smoke than wood. But fire was not the only source of heat. Our ancestors developed clothing that was so effective, so brilliantly engineered, that modern outdoor equipment manufacturers are still trying to catch up. The invention of the eyed needle around 40,000 years ago was a technological revolution. It seems like such a simple thing, a tiny sliver of bone with a hole drilled through one end. But it changed everything. Before the needle, humans wore draped animal hides, a skin thrown over the shoulders, a fur wrapped around the waist. These provided some insulation, but they left gaps. Wind penetrated, heat escaped, movement was restricted. The needle changed all of that. For the first time, humans could sew fitted garments, tunics that covered the entire torso, trousers with separate legs, hoods that protected the head and neck, mittens for the hands, boots with multiple layers, fur underwear. Archaeologists have found evidence of this tailored clothing revolution at sites across Siberia. The discovery of bone needles alongside the remains of fur-bearing animals like Arctic foxes, wolves, and wolverines tells a clear story. These animals were not just hunted for food. They were hunted specifically for their pelts, which were then carefully sewn into multi-layered clothing systems. The most effective garments used a technique that modern Arctic peoples still employ today. The inner layer had the fur facing inward, against the skin, trapping body heat in a warm air pocket. The outer layer had the fur facing outward, shedding wind and snow. Between them, a layer of trapped air provided additional insulation. This system was so effective that a properly dressed human could survive temperatures of 60 below zero while remaining comfortable. But perhaps the most remarkable technique of Ice Age survival was not a technology at all. It was social cooperation. An individual human cannot survive an Ice Age winter alone. The challenges are simply too great. But a group of 20 or 30 people, working together, sharing resources, dividing labor, protecting each other, that group can survive almost anything. The evidence for cooperation is everywhere in the archaeological record. Hunting large game required coordinated teams. Building mammoth bone huts required collective labor. Caring for the injured and sick. And we know they did this because we have found skeletons of individuals who survived severe injuries that would have been fatal without long-term care. This care could only have been provided by a group. One of the most famous examples is a Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar-1, found in Iraq. This individual had suffered a crushed skull, a withered right arm, and a missing hand. He was also blind in one eye and probably deaf. Any one of these injuries would have made survival difficult. All of them together should have meant certain death. And yet, Shanidar-1 lived to be between 40 and 50 years old, ancient by Paleolithic standards. This was only possible because his group took care of him for decades. Cooperation extended to knowledge sharing as well. Ice Age humans developed detailed mental maps of their territories. They knew where to find flint for tools. They knew the migration routes of the animals they hunted. They knew which plants were edible and which were medicinal. They knew the location of every cave, every water source, every natural shelter for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. This knowledge was passed down through generations. Grandparents taught grandchildren. Experienced hunters taught novices. The accumulated wisdom of a lifetime was shared freely, because in the Ice Age, knowledge was as valuable as food. There is one final survival method that deserves mention, and it is perhaps the most human of all: art. Deep inside caves across Europe, our ancestors left paintings that have survived for 30,000 years. Images of mammoths, bison, horses, and rhinoceroses. Handprints pressed against stone walls. Abstract patterns whose meaning we may never understand. Why did they do this? Why invest precious time and resources into creating art when survival was so precarious? Many archaeologists believe that cave art served a spiritual purpose. It was part of hunting magic, rituals designed to ensure success in the hunt. Others suggest it was a form of communication, a way to record essential information about the animals that sustained them. But I think there is a simpler explanation. Art is what makes us human. In the darkest, coldest, most dangerous environment imaginable, our ancestors crawled deep underground and created beauty. They painted their world because they needed to make sense of it. They needed to leave a mark. They needed to say, "We were here, we mattered, and we understood this world well enough to capture its essence on a stone wall." That impulse to create, to understand, to communicate, that is the ultimate survival method. It is what separates us from every other species that has ever lived, and it was forged in the crucible of the Ice Age. So the next time you complain about the weather, remember this. Your ancestors survived a world of glaciers, mammoths, and endless winter. They did it with bone needles, mammoth fat lamps, and coordinated persistence hunts. They did it by building houses out of the skeletons of giant beasts. They did it by taking care of each other. And they did it so well that their descendants, you and me, are here today, living in a world they could never have imagined. The Ice Age was not just a challenge our ancestors overcame. It was the forge in which modern humanity was made. Every adaptation, every innovation, every instinct that kept them alive, it is all still inside us, waiting for the next time the world turns cold.